The photograph hit the internet like a seismic shock wave. Nathaniel Brooks was sitting in his Tribeca penthouse, sipping a $50 scotch, waiting for his ex-wife to finally hit rock bottom. He had engineered her ruin perfectly, leaving her with nothing but a bruised ego and a bruised bank account. But then his phone buzzed. It was a blurry paparazzi shot from the private terrace of Le Jardin Secret, the most exclusive restaurant in the city. There was Madeleine, looking effortlessly radiant, her head thrown back in laughter. And the man pouring her vintage champagne? Damien Alistair, the elusive billionaire who notoriously never dated. Nathaniel's glass slipped, shattering on the hardwood floor. The mahogany conference table in the law offices of Collins and Hayes felt as cold as a slab in a morgue. Madeleine Brooks, soon to be Madeleine Hayes again, stared at the thick stack of papers resting in front of her. Across the table sat her husband of 10 years, Nathaniel. He didn't look like a man whose marriage was dissolving. He looked like a CEO who had just successfully executed a hostile takeover. "Sign on the dotted line, Maddie. Let's not make this uglier than it needs to be," Nathaniel said, checking his Rolex. It was a gift she had bought him 5 years ago, back when he actually looked at her with something resembling affection. Nathaniel's lawyer, Peter Collins, offered a thin, practiced smile. "As per the prenuptial agreement signed in 2016, Mrs. Brooks, you are entitled to the lump sum of $50,000, the primary residence in Manhattan, the Hamptons estate, and all equity in Brooks Financial remain solely under Mr. Brooks's name." $50,000. To a normal person, it was a safety net. In Nathaniel's world, it was the cost of a weekend getaway to St. Bart's. Madeleine felt a suffocating tightness in her chest. She had signed that prenup when they were 22. Back then, Nathaniel was drowning in student debt and operating his fledgling wealth management firm out of a cramped garage. Madeleine had worked 2 jobs, waitressing by day, bookkeeping for him by night, just to keep them afloat. She had poured her 20s into building his empire. She had hosted the dinners, charmed the investors, and smoothed over his aggressive edges. And now, because he had found a loophole classifying her contributions as unpaid domestic support, she was walking away with essentially nothing. "You built this company on my back, Nate," Madeleine said, her voice trembling but surprisingly clear in the quiet room. Nathaniel scoffed, adjusting his custom-tailored Italian suit. "I built this company with my brain, Madeleine. You picked out the curtains and made sure the caterers didn't burn the salmon at our parties. Don't confuse being a +1 with being a partner." The sheer audacity of his rewrite of history struck her silent. She knew why he was doing this. It wasn't just about money. It was about power. 3 months ago, Madeleine had discovered a folder on Nathaniel's laptop. It wasn't financial spreadsheets. It was a trove of receipts, jewelry, luxury hotels, private flights, all purchased for Chloe Sinclair, his 26-year-old junior vice president. When Madeleine confronted him, Nathaniel hadn't apologized. Instead, he had been annoyed at being caught. "Grow up, Maddie," he had told her. "This is how the world works. I provide for you. Let me have my fun." When she demanded a divorce, he promised to destroy her, and Nathaniel Brooks was a man of his word. Madeleine picked up the heavy Mont Blanc pen. She could fight it. She could spend the next 5 years dragging this through the courts, bleeding out in legal fees she couldn't afford, while Nathaniel's high-priced sharks buried her in paperwork. Or she could cut the rot out of her life right now. She signed her name 5 times. When she pushed the papers back across the table, Nathaniel's smirk widened. "I'll give you until Friday to get your things out of the penthouse," Nathaniel said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. He leaned down, his voice dropping to a low, mocking whisper. "You'll be back in 6 months, Maddie. When that 50 grand runs out, and you realize no one in this city cares about a 32-year-old ex-wife with no resume. You'll come begging for a job as my receptionist. You're nothing without my name." Madeleine didn't look at him. She stood up, grabbed her coat, and walked out of the office. She didn't cry. The tears would come later. Right now, all she felt was the cold, terrifying wind of a sudden free fall. The reality of her new life set in on a rainy Tuesday. Madeline sat on a second-hand futon in a cramped fourth-floor walk-up in Astoria, Queens. The radiator clanked aggressively, and the faint smell of stale cigarettes wafted in from the hallway. It had been 4 weeks since the ink dried on the divorce papers. Nathaniel had moved Chloe into the Tribeca penthouse the very next day. Madeline knew this because Chloe made sure to document every moment on her public Instagram. "New beginnings in our dream home," the caption read, accompanied by a photo of Chloe wearing the exact diamond tennis bracelet Madeline had admired at Tiffany's months prior. Madeline aggressively closed her laptop. Social media was a form of self-flagellation she needed to break. The $50,000 was already dwindling. First, month's rent, a hefty security deposit, basic furniture, and a mountain of hidden fees had taken a massive bite out of her safety net. Then came the reality of the job market. Nathaniel had been right about one thing. A 10-year gap on a resume was a death sentence in the corporate world. Madeline had applied to over 60 jobs: event planning, public relations, administrative assistants. The few interviews she managed to secure ended in polite, condescending rejections. "You have great soft skills, Madeline, but we're looking for someone with recent, hands-on software experience." Her friends had abandoned her with breathtaking speed. The women she had brunched with on the Upper East Side, the wives of Nathaniel's colleagues, stopped returning her calls. When she bumped into Vanessa Sterling, one of her supposed best friends, at a coffee shop, Vanessa had looked at her like she was carrying a contagious disease, mumbled an excuse about being late for Pilates, and fled. In Nathaniel's world, loyalty was tied to proximity to power. Madeline was no longer powerful. She was a cautionary tale. Nathaniel didn't stop at just winning the divorce. He initiated a campaign of psychological warfare. He cancelled her phone plan without warning. He accidentally let it slip to their mutual circles that Madeline was unstable, claiming the divorce was due to her erratic behavior. She hit her lowest point when she had to pawn the only piece of jewelry Nathaniel hadn't legally claimed, a vintage sapphire ring her grandmother had left her, just to ensure she had enough buffer to pay for her new, exorbitant health insurance premium. Standing in the pawn shop, listening to the proprietor offer her a fraction of the ring's worth, Madeline finally broke down. She cried on the subway ride home, the harsh fluorescent lights illuminating her defeat. She had let a man define her entire existence, and when he removed himself, she simply ceased to exist. "You are not dying here," her college roommate, Sarah Jenkins, told her over the phone that night. Sarah was a tough-as-nails ER nurse who had never liked Nathaniel. "You survived a decade with a narcissistic sociopath. You can survive Queens. You just need a foot in the door anywhere. Stop applying for the penthouse jobs. Aim for the ground floor." Sarah was right. Madeline swallowed the last of her pride and walked into the offices of Lumiere Events, a high-end, high-stress catering and event planning company known for running the most extravagant galas in New York. She didn't ask for a management position. She applied as a freelance assistant floor coordinator. The owner, a terrifyingly sharp woman named Beatrice Vanguard, looked over Madeline's application. "You're Nathaniel Brooks's ex-wife," Beatrice noted bluntly, peering over her reading glasses. "I did a dinner party for him last year. He was a nightmare about the truffles." "I am," Madeline said, keeping her chin high, "which means I know exactly how demanding your clientele is. I know how to handle high-pressure meltdowns, and I am desperate enough to work double shifts without complaining." Beatrice stared at her for a long, uncomfortable moment. $20 an hour. You wear black. You do the heavy lifting. You deal with the drunken guests. And if you mess up a seating chart, I will fire you on the spot. Start tomorrow. It was grueling. Madeline spent her days hauling boxes of floral arrangements, steaming hundreds of silk tablecloths, and being yelled at by neurotic brides and arrogant CEOs. Her feet bled in her sensible black flats. Her back ached. But for the first time in 10 years, the money she made was hers. Every $20 bill felt like a brick she was using to rebuild her own foundation. She worked tirelessly, quietly absorbing the logistics of the massive operations. She was invisible to the wealthy guests she served, the same people she used to dine with, and she found a strange comfort in that anonymity. She was no longer Nathaniel's wife. She was just Maddie, the girl in the black uniform making sure the champagne towers didn't fall. And she was surviving. 3 months into her job at Lumiere, Beatrice landed the contract of the year, the Innovators of Tomorrow Gala, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was a chaotic, high-stakes night. 600 of the world's most powerful people were in attendance. Madeline was running on 4 hours of sleep and 3 cups of black coffee. She was assigned to manage the VIP mezzanine, a private section cordoned off for the true elite, the billionaires, the tech giants, the old money. At 10 p.m., disaster struck. A waiter carrying a tray of red wine collided with a guest, narrowly missing the guest's couture gown, but thoroughly soaking the custom silk draping boss near the private lounge entrance. Beatrice screamed through the earpiece, "Maddie, get to the VIP lounge entrance, now! Rip the damaged draping down and replace it with the silver velvet from storage before the press catches sight of it." Madeline sprinted down the service corridor, hauling a heavy bag of velvet fabric. She reached the secluded alcove leading to the private lounge. It was quiet here, away from the pulsing bass of the orchestra in the main hall. She dropped to her knees, frantically unhooking the stained silk. As she wrestled with a particularly stubborn brass clasp near the floor, a voice broke the silence. "If you're trying to break in, I think you need better tools." Madeline startled, dropping her wrench. She looked up. Standing in the shadows of the alcove was a man. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo like the rest of the guests. He wore a sharp, dark charcoal suit, the tie already loosened, looking as if he had dressed up under extreme duress. He had dark, messy hair and striking, deeply tired green eyes. He was holding a glass of club soda, leaning against a marble pillar. "I'm not breaking in," Madeline said, wiping a smudge of dust from her cheek, suddenly acutely aware of her messy bun and simple staff uniform. "I'm doing damage control. Someone murdered the silk." The man stepped forward, crouching down next to her. Up close, she noticed he smelled like cedarwood and rain. He didn't look at her with the dismissive glaze most of the elite reserved for the staff. He looked at her with genuine amusement. "Here, let me," he said, taking the wrench from her hand. Before she could protest, he easily twisted the stubborn clasp free, bringing the ruined silk down. "Thank you," Madeline breathed, surprised, "though I'm pretty sure you're not supposed to be doing manual labor in a Brioni suit." "It's Tom Ford, actually, and I needed the distraction," he replied, handing the wrench back. He looked towards the loud, glittering hall with a profound look of distaste. "It's a shark tank out there. Everyone is pitching an app, asking for a favor, or trying to figure out how much I'm worth." I had to hide. Madeline smiled, a real, unforced smile. "Well, you picked a bad hiding spot. This is the thoroughfare for the kitchen staff. If Beatrice catches you loitering here, she'll hand you a tray of hors d'oeuvres." He laughed, a rich, warm sound that echoed in the quiet hallway. "I might prefer that. Serving food sounds a lot more honest than what's going on in that ballroom." "Don't romanticize it," Madeline said, standing up and hoisting the heavy velvet roll. "Your feet go numb after hour 6, and you develop a profound hatred for bacon-wrapped scallops." The man stood up as well, effortlessly taking the heavy roll of fabric from her. "Point taken. I'm damn." "Maddie," she said. She didn't offer her hand, as hers were covered in dust, but she held his gaze. There was an intense, magnetic pull to him. He was entirely unpretentious, yet he carried an undeniable aura of authority. For the next 10 minutes, Dam stayed in the alcove, holding the fabric, while Madeline pinned it into place. They bantered easily. He asked her about the chaos behind the scenes of events. She asked him what he did to avoid wearing a tuxedo. "I run a tech firm," he said vaguely. "Lots of screens, lots of headaches." "Ah, a computer nerd in a fancy suit," Madeline teased. "Exactly," he smiled. "What about you, Maddie? You handle high-stress fabric emergencies like a pro, but you don't seem like you've been doing this your whole life." Madeline paused, a pin halfway to the wall. For a second, the ghost of Nathaniel's sneer flashed in her mind. "You're nothing." She swallowed hard. "I'm starting over. I spent a long time building someone else's life. Now I'm just trying to build my own." Dam's expression softened. The amusement faded, replaced by something deep and understanding. "Starting over is the hardest thing in the world," he said quietly. "But it's also the only way to find out what you're actually made of." "Maddie! Status!" Beatrice's voice shrieked in her earpiece, making her wince. "I have to go," Madeline said, hurriedly gathering her tools. "Duty calls. Good luck hiding, Dam." "Wait," he said, stepping forward. "Maddie." Before he could finish, Beatrice rounded the corner, her face red with stress. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw them. All the colour drained from Beatrice's face. "Mr. Alistair," Beatrice gasped, her voice completely changing into a sycophantic purr. "I am so sorry. Is my staff bothering you? We have a private tasting room set up for you, if you'd prefer to get away from the crowd." Madeline froze. Her heart dropped to her stomach. Mr. Alistair. She knew that name. Everyone in New York knew that name. Damien Alistair, the founder of Alistair Holdings, a notoriously reclusive billionaire whose investments moved global markets. He wasn't just a computer nerd. He was one of the wealthiest men on the eastern seaboard. Madeline looked at Dam, horrified that she had just spent 10 minutes treating a billionaire like a busboy. Dam didn't look at Beatrice. His eyes were locked on Madeline. "No, Beatrice," Dam said, his voice suddenly authoritative, stripping away the casual, joking demeanour he had just shown Madeline. "Your staff wasn't bothering me at all. In fact, she was the only genuine person I've spoken to all night." He gave Madeline one last, lingering look. "It was a pleasure, Maddie." As he walked away, disappearing into the VIP lounge, Beatrice turned on Madeline, her eyes wide. "Do you have any idea who that was?" Beatrice hissed. "I do now," Madeline whispered, her hands shaking slightly as she looked down the empty hallway. She had expected to be fired. Instead, the next morning, when Madeline arrived at the Lumiere warehouse, there was a massive arrangement of white orchids sitting on the front desk. Beatrice was staring at them in shock. "They're for you," she told Madeline. Madeline approached the desk. Nestled in the rare orchids was a thick, cream-coloured envelope. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a handwritten note on heavy cardstock. "Maddie, I realise I wasn't entirely forthcoming last night. I'd like to apologise for the deception. Let me buy you dinner to make up for it. No tuxedos, no bacon-wrapped scallops. Just honest conversation. Damn, P.S. I left a number on the back. Call me." Madeline stared at the card. A tech billionaire, a man who could have any woman in the world, asking the broke, divorced cater-waiter out to dinner. Nathaniel had told her she was nothing, that she would crawl back to him in the dirt. Madeline looked at the flowers, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. She flipped the card over, pulled out her cheap prepaid phone, and dialed the number. The black SUV idling outside Madeline's Astoria apartment building on a brisk Thursday evening was aggressively inconspicuous. There was no chauffeur in a peaked cap, no flashy rims, just heavily tinted windows and quiet, armoured efficiency. When Madeline climbed into the back seat, wearing a simple navy slip dress she had bought at a sample sale 3 years ago, Dam was already there, typing on a tablet. He looked up, and the sharp lines of his face immediately softened. He tossed the tablet aside. "You look incredible, Maddie." "And you look like you actually slept," Madeline noted, taking in his relaxed posture. He was wearing a dark cashmere sweater and tailored trousers, looking miles away from the cornered billionaire she had met in the museum alcove. "I managed 6 hours," Dam smiled, pouring her a glass of sparkling water from the console, a personal record for this quarter. He didn't take her to Percé or Le Bernardin. Instead, the SUV navigated through the narrow, cobblestone streets of the West Village, pulling up to a dimly lit, unmarked door. It was an exclusive, reservation-only speakeasy and Italian kitchen, known among the city's old guard as Il Rifugio. The owner, an older man named Giovanni, greeted Dam with a warm embrace and led them to a secluded corner booth draped in heavy velvet curtains. There was no menu. Giovanni simply brought out plates of handmade burrata, truffle risotto, and a bottle of Barolo that Madeleine knew cost more than her current monthly rent. Over dinner, the conversation flowed with an ease Madeleine hadn't experienced in a decade. With Nathaniel, dinners had been performances. She was expected to laugh at the right moments, agree with his business philosophies, and look picturesque. With Dam, there was no script. He asked her about her life before Nathaniel. He listened intently as she described her early 20s, working as a bookkeeper, balancing ledgers, and finding a strange satisfaction in making chaotic numbers align perfectly. "I loved the architecture of a good spreadsheet," Madeleine admitted, swirling the dark wine in her glass. It felt like solving a puzzle. But when Nathaniel's firm took off, he hired a whole accounting department. I was transitioned into aesthetics. Managing the house, managing the calendar, managing him. Dam frowned, his green eyes darkening in the candlelight. "He took your operational skills and downgraded them to optics. That's not just arrogant. It's bad business." Madeleine laughed softly, a bitter edge to the sound. "He told me my contributions were just picking out curtains. When we divorced, he used an ironclad prenup to walk away with everything. I built the foundation of his company, Dam, and he tossed me a $50,000 severance package for a decade of my life." Dam didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't tell her it was going to be okay. He leaned forward, his forearms resting on the table, looking at her with piercing intensity. "Then you build your own foundation, Maddie. He didn't take your brain in the divorce settlement. The woman who reorganized the VIP logistics at a Metropolitan Museum gala in under 10 minutes while dealing with Beatrice Vanguard doesn't belong in a catering uniform." "It pays the rent," Madeleine said defensively. "For now," Dam agreed. "But what's next?" That question became the catalyst for the next 2 months. Madeleine and Dam didn't rush into a fiery, public romance. Their relationship was built in the quiet, hidden spaces of New York, late-night coffee in his private library, walks through Central Park at dawn before the paparazzi woke up, and long conversations about logistics, market gaps, and business strategies. Dam was a sounding board, challenging her to think bigger. When Madeleine noticed massive inefficiencies in Lumiere Events' supply chain, wasted floral budgets, overlapping vendor fees, and poorly negotiated venue contracts, she didn't just complain about it. At Dam's urging, she drafted a comprehensive 40-page operational restructuring plan. She presented it to Beatrice Vanguard on a Tuesday morning. Beatrice, initially annoyed, read the document in silence. When she looked up, her expression had shifted from condescension to calculating respect. "You're saving me $300,000 a quarter with these vendor renegotiations," Beatrice said flatly. "Yes," Madeleine replied, holding her ground. "And in return, I want off the floor. I want the title of Director of Operations, a 6-figure salary, and a 5% commission on the quarterly savings." Beatrice narrowed her eyes. "You have nerve, Brooks." "It's Hayes now," Madeleine corrected smoothly. "And it's a bargain, Beatrice. You know it." She got the job. The promotion meant she could finally move out of the Astoria walk-up and into a bright, modern loft in Brooklyn. She was no longer Nathaniel Brooks's discarded ex-wife. She was a formidable operational director in her own right. To celebrate, Dame insisted on taking her out to Le Jardin Secret, a highly visible, incredibly exclusive rooftop restaurant in Chelsea. He rented the private terrace. It was a risky move. Dam usually avoided the public eye like the plague, but he wanted to celebrate her victory in the light. They drank vintage champagne. Madeline laughed, her head thrown back, feeling a profound, intoxicating sense of freedom. She wasn't an accessory anymore. She was an equal. Neither of them noticed the flash of a long-lens camera from a neighboring high-rise. The photograph hit page 6 the following morning. The recluse and the ex-wife, billionaire Damien Alistair, spotted dining with Madeline Hayes, former bride of Wall Street, shark Nathaniel Brooks. In his sprawling Tribeca penthouse, Nathaniel Brooks stared at his iPad, his jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ached. The Scotch glass he had dropped lay in pieces on the rug, a dark stain spreading across the expensive wool. Madeline. She looked stunning in the photo. Not the tired, anxious woman he had bullied out of his office 6 months ago, but radiant, confident, and draped in an aura of untouched wealth. And Damien Alistair was looking at her like she was the only woman in the world. "Nate, are you listening to me?" Chloe's whining voice echoed from the master bathroom. She walked out, wearing a silk robe, holding up 2 different pairs of diamond earrings. "I can't decide which ones to wear to the Hampton Classic. The teardrops feel too heavy, but the studs are so boring." Nathaniel looked at Chloe, and for the first time, the illusion shattered. He saw the shallow, vapid reality of the woman he had blown up his life for. She didn't know the first thing about his business. She didn't know how to soothe his anxieties or manage the intricate social web of their investors. She just knew how to spend his money. "Wear whatever you want, Chloe." "It doesn't matter," he snapped, turning his attention back to the screen. His phone began to ring. It was Peter Collins, his lawyer and confidant. "Tell me you're seeing this," Peter said, skipping the greeting. "I'm seeing it," Nathaniel growled. "How the hell did she manage this? Alistair doesn't date. He barely leaves his compound in Greenwich." "I don't know, Nate, but we have bigger problems than your ex-wife's social climbing." Peter's voice was grim. "The commercial real estate portfolio in Chicago just tanked. The primary developer filed for bankruptcy an hour ago. We are over-leveraged by about $80 million. The blood drained from Nathaniel's face. Brooks Financial had bet the house on that development. If the news got out, their clients would pull their funds in a panic. It would be a bloodbath. "We need a capital injection," Nathaniel said, pacing the length of the penthouse, panic rising in his chest. "We need a whale to buy our debt and partner on the restructuring. There's only one firm with that kind of liquid capital ready to deploy by Friday," Peter said hesitantly. "Alistair Holdings," Nathaniel breathed. "I can try to get us a meeting with his acquisitions team," Peter offered. "But Nate, given the news this morning, do you think that's wise?" Nathaniel's ego flared, blinding his judgment. "Business is business, Peter. Alistair is a shark. If the numbers make sense, he won't care who I used to be married to. Get to the meeting. I'll pitch them myself." 3 days later, Nathaniel walked into the soaring glass and steel lobby of Alistair Holdings in Hudson Yards. He was wearing his best power suit, carrying a bespoke leather briefcase containing the financial salvation of his company. He was sweating, despite the aggressive air conditioning. A sleek, silent elevator shot him up to the 75th floor. An assistant led him down a quiet, minimalist corridor towards the primary boardroom. "Mr. Alistair's team is waiting for you, Mr. Brooks," the assistant said, opening the heavy frosted glass doors. Nathaniel stepped into the room, pasting on his most confident, winning smile. "Good morning, everyone. I appreciate you taking the time." The words died in his throat. Sitting at the head of the massive, polished oak table was Damien Alistair, wearing a sharp navy suit, his expression unreadable. But it wasn't Dam that made Nathaniel's blood freeze. Sitting directly to Dam's right, with an open laptop, a stack of financial dossiers, and a silver pen in her hand, was Madeline. She was wearing a perfectly tailored white blazer, her hair pulled back into a sleek chignon. She looked like a predator waiting for her prey. Nathaniel physically stumbled backward, his hand catching the doorframe. What What is this? Dam folded his hands on the table. Mr. Brooks, have a seat. We have a lot of numbers to get through. Madeline, Nathaniel choked out, ignoring Dam, his eyes locked on his ex-wife in horror. What are you doing here? Madeline didn't flinch. She didn't look angry, or smug, or vindictive. She looked entirely professional, which somehow made it infinitely worse. I am consulting for Alistair Holdings on operational risk assessment, Nathaniel, Madeline said, her voice cool and steady. Dam asked me to review the structural integrity of Brooks Financial before his firm considers acquiring your distressed assets. Please sit down. Nathaniel felt his stomach drop into a bottomless abyss. The woman he had discarded, the woman he had told was nothing without his name, was now holding the executioner's axe over his entire empire. He slowly lowered himself into the chair opposite them, his hands shaking as he opened his briefcase. Let's skip the pitch, Nathaniel, Dam said, leaning back in his chair. I've reviewed your proposal. You want $80 million to cover the Chicago fallout, in exchange for a 20% equity stake in your firm. It's a very generous offer, Nathaniel stammered, his usual charisma evaporating under the cold stares of the two people across from him. Your historical returns are irrelevant when your current operational structure is a house of cards, Madeline interrupted. She slid a thick, red-tabbed folder across the table toward him. I've spent the last 48 hours auditing your internal ledgers, Nate, Madeline continued, tapping her pen against the table. The ones you didn't include in this pitch deck. You haven't just over-leveraged the Chicago deal. You've been siphoning operational capital to fund personal shell companies for the last 3 years to avoid luxury taxes. Nathaniel's face turned ash-gray. That's a lie. You don't know what you're talking about, Maddie. You're just an event planner. She's the smartest operational mind in this city, Dam corrected, his voice dangerously low, and she knows exactly what she's talking about, because she built the foundational architecture of your firm's accounting software. She knows where all the trapdoors are. Madeline opened her laptop, the screen reflecting in her eyes. Page 4, Nathaniel, the Cayman accounts. Page 7, the phantom consulting fees paid to Sinclair Logistics. I assume that's Chloe's little side project you funded with client money. It's sloppy, it's reckless, and it makes your firm highly toxic. Nathaniel was hyperventilating now. The walls of the boardroom felt like they were closing in. He looked at Madeline, desperately searching for the soft, compliant girl who used to iron his shirts and rub his shoulders after a long day. She was gone. In her place was a woman forged in the fire he had set. Maddie, please, Nathaniel whispered, his voice cracking, the arrogant veneer completely shattered. If you kill this deal, my firm goes under. I lose everything. Madeline looked at him, and for a fleeting second, she remembered the coldness of the mahogany table at Collins and Hayes. She remembered him checking his Rolex. You'll come begging for a job. You're nothing. I'm not killing anything, Nate, Madeline said softly, her tone entirely devoid of pity. Your own bad business practices did that. I'm just here to protect my clients' investments. She turned to Dam, closing her laptop with a decisive click. My assessment is complete, Mr. Alistair. Brooks Financial is a critical liability. I strongly advise against any acquisition or capital injection. It's a sinking ship. Dam nodded once, his eyes locked on Nathaniel's pale, ruined face. Thank you, Miss Hayes. Your counsel is, as always, invaluable. Dam stood up, buttoning his jacket. You have your answer, Mr. Brooks. I suggest you call your bankruptcy lawyers. The meeting is over. In now. Nathaniel sat frozen in his chair, surrounded by the ruins of his own arrogance, as Madeline and Dam walked out of the boardroom together, leaving him completely, utterly alone. The descent of Nathaniel Brooks was not a slow, graceful glide into obscurity. It was a terrifying, unmitigated freefall, When he finally stumbled out of the Alastair Holdings elevator and onto the unforgiving pavement of Hudson Yards, the sky above Manhattan had turned the color of bruised iron. He checked his phone. 34 missed calls. 12 were from Peter Collins. The rest were from furious board members and panicked investors. The rumor mill on Wall Street operated faster than high-frequency trading algorithms. By the time Nathaniel's black car pulled up to his Tribeca penthouse, whispers of the Alastair rejection had already leaked. The Chicago real estate default was no longer a contained crisis. It was front-page financial news. Nathaniel burst through the mahogany double doors of his penthouse, desperate for the familiar comfort of his manufactured kingdom. "Chloe!" he shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings and the modern, abstract art he had purchased to impress clients. There was no answer. He strode into the master suite and stopped dead. The walk-in closet, usually a meticulously organized shrine to European designer labels, looked as though it had been ransacked. Open, empty garment bags littered the floor. Chloe was standing by the bed, violently shoving a stack of cashmere sweaters into a massive Louis Vuitton trunk. "What are you doing?" Nathaniel demanded, the panic in his chest morphing into hot, irrational anger. Chloe didn't even look up. She tossed a velvet jewelry box into her purse and snapped it shut. "I'm going to my sister's in Aspen, Nate. My black card was declined at Bergdorf's an hour ago. The manager came out and quietly told me the account was frozen. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was? The accounts are temporarily restricted while Peter handles a liquidity issue." Nathaniel lied, his voice cracking. "I need you here. We have a gala tomorrow night for the Wellington Trust, and we need to project stability." Chloe finally stopped packing and looked at him. The facade of the adoring, starry-eyed junior executive was entirely gone. Her eyes were hard, calculating, and chillingly devoid of affection. "There is no Wellington Trust gala, Nate. Look at your phone," she said flatly. "Wellington pulled their capital 2 hours ago. The firm is dead, you're dead, and I am not going down on a sinking ship to play the supportive wife." "I left my wife for you!" Nathaniel screamed, crossing the room and grabbing her arm. Chloe yanked her arm out of his grasp with a look of profound disgust. "You didn't leave her for me, Nathaniel. You left her because she stopped feeding your ego. And you bought me because you thought I'd never challenge you. Well, my lease on this arrangement is up." She grabbed her coat, zipped the trunk, and wheeled it past him. As the front door of the penthouse clicked shut, the silence in the apartment became deafening. Nathaniel sank onto the edge of the mattress, burying his face in his hands. The empire he had built on a foundation of hubris and betrayal was collapsing, and the architect of his destruction was the woman he had deemed completely worthless. Meanwhile, 40 blocks away in a sunlit, exposed brick office in Chelsea, Madeline Hayes was signing a very different set of papers. "Make sure the arbitration clauses are ironclad, David," Madeline said, passing the thick contract across the glass table to her newly hired general counsel, David Carmichael. "If we are going to restructure the supply chains for these mid-tier tech firms, we need absolute authority over their vendor terminations." David, a sharp, veteran corporate lawyer who had abandoned a white shoe firm for the chance to work with her, nodded approvingly. "They're bulletproof, Madeline. Aegis Operational Consulting is officially incorporated, insured, and ready to deploy." Madeline leaned back in her ergonomic chair, exhaling a long, steady breath. It had been 4 months since the confrontation in Dam's boardroom. The fallout for Nathaniel had been catastrophic. Brooks Financial had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy 3 weeks later, and Nathaniel was currently fending off a dozen civil lawsuits from defrauded investors. But Madeline hadn't wasted a single moment gloating. Instead, she had harnessed the momentum. Word of her surgical dismantling of Brooks Financial had spread quietly among the city's elite billionaires and hedge fund managers. Suddenly, everyone wanted the brilliant, analytical woman who had spotted the fatal flaws in a seemingly invincible Wall Street darling. Dam had offered to seed Aegis Consulting with a $10 million investment. Madeline had refused the gift. Instead, she drafted a rigorous business proposal and took it to him as a formal pitch, securing a $2 million loan with a strict repayment schedule and a 5% interest rate. "I won't be beholden to another man's money, Dam," she had told him late one night, sitting on the balcony of his Hamptons estate, listening to the waves crash against the shore. "Even yours." Dam had simply smiled, pouring her a glass of wine, his eyes full of deep, unwavering respect. "I wouldn't expect anything less, Maddie. You don't need my money to conquer the world. You just needed the runway." Their relationship had blossomed into something rare and formidable. They were a true partnership, built on mutual respect, intellectual equality, and a fierce, protective loyalty. Dam, once the elusive recluse, now proudly accompanied Madeline to charity galas and tech summits. The media dubbed them the Architects of Manhattan, a power couple whose combined influence could make or break industries. Madeline even brought her old friend Sarah Jenkins on board. She had lured the tough ER nurse away from the hospital with double her salary, placing Sarah in charge of corporate healthcare logistics and wellness programs for Aegis's massive client roster. As Madeline stood up from her desk, looking out over the bustling New York skyline, her phone buzzed with an incoming call from Beatrice Vanguard. "Madeline," Beatrice's voice came through, completely stripped of her former condescension. "I'm looking at the quarterly projections you sent over for Lumiere's restructuring. The vendor consolidation model is brilliant. I want to retain Aegis on a permanent basis." Madeline smiled, tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "My retainer fee has doubled since last month, Beatrice." "Send the invoice," Beatrice replied without a moment's hesitation. Madeline hung up the phone, a deep sense of satisfaction warming her chest. She had clawed her way out of the dirt, entirely on her own terms. But the past, as she was about to discover, had one final, venomous strike left to make. The letter arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning, hand-delivered by a weary-looking process server. It was a subpoena from the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. Madeline read the document in her office, her brow furrowing. It wasn't a civil suit. It was a federal summons. The Securities and Exchange Commission, in conjunction with the FBI, had launched a full criminal investigation into the collapse of Brooks Financial, and Nathaniel Brooks was pointing the finger directly at her. "He's claiming you masterminded the offshore tax evasion," David Carmichael said, pacing frantically in front of Madeline's desk, reviewing a copy of Nathaniel's sworn affidavit. He found a sleazy defense attorney, Gregory Tate. Tate's strategy is to throw you to the wolves. Nathaniel is testifying that because you were his bookkeeper during the early years of the firm, you set up the Cayman Shell companies without his knowledge. He's claiming he was just the charismatic face of the company, and you were the shadow accountant, pulling the strings. Madeline felt a brief, sickening jolt of adrenaline. Nathaniel was cornered, facing up to 15 years in federal prison for wire fraud and embezzlement. Like a cornered animal, he was lashing out, using the very skills she had once utilized to build his company as a weapon to destroy her. He's going to use the fact that I didn't have a formal corporate title against me, Madeline reasoned, her mind working furiously. He's going to say I operated off the books, and because my name was on the initial incorporation documents a decade ago, he thinks he has a thread to hang me with. The door to her office swung open, and Dam walked in. He didn't look angry. He looked exceptionally calm, which Madeline knew from experience was his most dangerous state. "I just got off the phone with my legal team in Washington," Dam said, taking a seat beside David. "Nathaniel leaked his affidavit to the press. The Wall Street Journal is running a piece online right now, painting you as a rogue ex-wife who embezzled funds and then sabotaged his firm to cover your tracks." David dragged a hand down his face. "This is a disaster, Madeline. Even if we beat the charges, the PR nightmare will tank Aegis Consulting. Your clients will flee at the first hint of an SEC indictment. Madeline looked at the subpoena. Then she looked at Dam. The panic that had momentarily gripped her evaporated, replaced by cold, crystalline clarity. Nathaniel had fundamentally misunderstood who he was dealing with. He thought she was still the scared 20-something girl trying to keep his ledgers balanced. "David," Madeline said, her voice dropping to a dangerous hush. "Call investigator Robert Callahan at the SEC. Tell him I waive my right to a delayed deposition. I want a formal, recorded sit-down with him, Nathaniel, and his lawyer. Tomorrow." "Maddie, that's incredibly risky," David warned. "You shouldn't be in the same room as him without a protracted legal strategy." "I have a strategy," Madeline said, unlocking her desk drawer and pulling out a small, encrypted hard drive. "Nathaniel thinks he's the only one who kept receipts." The conference room at the SEC field office in Lower Manhattan was sterile and blindingly bright. Nathaniel sat across the long table, flanked by his attorney, Gregory Tate. Nathaniel looked terrible. He had lost weight. His expensive suit hung loosely on his frame, and the dark circles under his eyes spoke of weeks without sleep. Yet when Madeline walked in with Dam and David, a flicker of his old, arrogant smirk returned. Investigator Callahan, a stern, grey-haired man with zero tolerance for Wall Street theatrics, clicked his pen. "We are on the record. Mr. Brooks, you have alleged under oath that your former wife, Madeline Hayes, orchestrated the creation of the Cayman Island shell accounts used to funnel $22 million in client funds." "That's correct," Nathaniel said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Madeline handled all back-end financial architecture. She created the dummy corporations using my forged digital signature. When we divorced, she demanded a massive payout. When I refused, she tipped off Alastair Holdings to ruin my reputation." Gregory Tate slid a stack of printed emails across the table. "We have correspondence from Mrs. Hayes's email address from 2018, authorizing wire transfers to Sinclair Logistics and 3 offshore entities." Callahan looked at Madeline. "Your response, Miss Hayes?" Madeline didn't even look at the emails. She opened her briefcase, pulled out her laptop, and connected the encrypted hard drive. "Investigator Callahan," Madeline began, her voice ringing clear and authoritative in the small room. "When I served as the bookkeeper for Brooks Financial, I realized early on that my husband had a habit of making reckless, undocumented trades. To protect myself, I created a shadow ledger. Every action I ever took on the firm's servers was digitally time-stamped, heavily encrypted, and backed up to an independent cloud server." Nathaniel's smirk faltered. "That's impossible. I had the IT department wipe your administrative access the day we divorced." "You did?" Madeline agreed smoothly, "which is why the metadata I am about to show Investigator Callahan is so fascinating." She turned the laptop screen towards the investigator. "This is a forensic audit I commissioned 3 days ago, tracing the exact IP addresses and MAC addresses of the devices used to authorize the fraudulent Cayman transfers." Madeline tapped a key, bringing up a complex digital roadmap. "As you can see, the emails Mr. Tate just presented were indeed sent from my account. However, the IP address originates from a private aviation Wi-Fi network registered to a Gulfstream G650. She finally looked directly into Nathaniel's eyes, watching the color rapidly drain from his face. "I have never been on that jet, Nathaniel," Madeline said softly, her tone carrying the weight of a gavel dropping. "But you were. On February 14th, 2018, flying to St. Bart's with Chloe Sinclair. You spoofed my email account using my old administrative password to authorize the transfers while you were over international waters." Gregory Tate snatched the laptop, his eyes frantically scanning the screen. This is inadmissible. We need to verify these forensic logs." "You are welcome to," Dam interjected smoothly, speaking for the first time. "The audit was conducted by Alastair Holdings' proprietary cybersecurity division. It has already been cross-referenced and authenticated by the FBI's Cyber Crimes Unit. We submitted the raw data to Director Callahan's office at 6 a.m. this morning. Investigator Callahan stared at the screen, then slowly looked up at Nathaniel. The air in the room grew instantly heavy. "Mr. Brooks," Callahan said, his voice dropping an octave, "did you knowingly falsify federal affidavits and attempt to frame an innocent party to obstruct an SEC investigation?" Nathaniel couldn't speak. His mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. He looked at Gregory Tate, but his lawyer was already pushing his chair away from the table, physically distancing himself from his radioactive client. "Nate," Madeline said, leaning forward slightly, "you told me I built your company on my back. You were wrong. I built the security of your company. And the moment you threw me out, you tore down your own firewalls." She closed her laptop, the sharp click echoing in the silent room. "I think we're done here, Director Callahan," David Carmichael said, standing up. "Yes, we are," Callahan agreed. He pressed a button on his desk phone. "Agents, you can come in now." The door opened, and 2 FBI agents stepped into the room. Nathaniel Brooks, the man who had once ruled his world with absolute, unquestioned authority, offered no resistance as they pulled his arms behind his back and secured the handcuffs. He didn't look angry anymore. He just looked broken. As Madeline and Dam walked out of the federal building and into the bright, crisp afternoon sun, a swarm of paparazzi was waiting. The news of Nathaniel's arrest had already broken. Flashbulbs erupted, and reporters shouted her name. Dam stepped slightly in front of her, ready to shield her from the chaos. But Madeline gently placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. She didn't want to hide anymore. She had spent a decade shrinking herself to fit into Nathaniel's shadow, and she was finally done. She stood tall, linking her arm through Dam's, offering the cameras a radiant, untouchable smile. "Where to, Miss Hayes?" Dam asked, a proud, brilliant smile matching her own. "Back to the office, Mr. Alistair," Madeline replied, stepping into the waiting town car. "We have an empire to run." The tragedy of Nathaniel Brooks was not that he lost his fortune, but that his arrogance blinded him to the true source of his power. He assumed Madeline was merely a decorative accessory, a replaceable cog in his magnificent machine. He failed to realize she was the engine. When he discarded her to chase an illusion, he engineered his own spectacular demise. Madeline's journey from a heartbroken, destitute ex-wife pawning her jewelry to a formidable corporate titan is a testament to the sheer, indomitable will of a woman scorned and underestimated. She didn't just survive the ashes of her divorce. She used them to forge a kingdom of her own design. In the end, the ultimate revenge wasn't destroying the man who broke her. It was proving to the world and to herself that she never actually needed him at all.